Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome into the episode 2 of the current DairyNZ Farmers Forum series, Crunch Time on Ag Emissions Pricing. What a big week it has already been for everyone. We're only at Wednesday evening, but from the lows of the red light framework to fantastic news on the payout front. So thank you all for joining us this evening. My name is Rowena Duncan, executive producer of the Country Radio Show and a former dairy farmer myself. I'm coming to you from Dunedin tonight, where although it has stopped raining, it has been very wet this afternoon, which will have been gratefully received by all of the farmers down here. Now, although it may seem quite a way off, agri-emissions pricing is coming in 2025, which will be here before we know it. There are some big discussions to be had and decisions to be made affecting the farming and agriculture sector. So it is best that we start thinking about this now and what it will mean for us as dairy farmers. Tonight, we're going to hear from a number of experts as well as an actual dairy farmer as well. They'll not only be talking us through the science of why methane needs to be reduced, but also putting some context around legislated targets as well. We'll also cover off the primary sector climate action partnership here, Waka Eke Noa, and the 2 potential pricing options as well. There is also the chance for you to join the discussion too. So throughout this session, we'll put 4 different polling questions to you around your understanding of various aspects relating to the proposed agri-emissions pricing. Now, rest assured, it is completely anonymous. There is no pressure to get it right. It just helps us gauge the level of understanding out there and tailor some of the answers that we're going to be given to help you as well. So more on this shortly, but I'll just run you through who is joining us this evening. Our first speaker is Roger Lincoln, Principal Policy Advisor for DairyNZ. Now, Roger will provide an overview of the political landscape, including legislation targets, the emissions trading scheme, and why the Waka Eke Noa partnership was established, plus what its commitments are. He's going to be followed by Dr. Adrian Macy, a well-respected climate change expert and commentator, who'll talk us through the science related to methane emissions. You'll then get the opportunity to put your questions to Roger and Adrian. I'll tell you how shortly, before hearing from Bruce Thorold, Strategy Investment Leader at DairyNZ, about Waka Eke Noa. He's quite an expert on that, and specifically the pricing options too. So we'll then wrap this evening's session with Waikato dairy farmer Sophia. She's got some questions to put to Bruce. Likely they will be the same ones that you'll want to know the answers to as well, but you do have the option to submit your own questions. So how do you do that? You can submit questions through our speakers and respond to our poll questions this evening. All you have to do is connect to menti.com, either by scanning the QR code on your screen, you can do that now, or by typing in menti.com to your browser and entering that code that's also on the screen now, 96607743. Now, we just ask that if you want to ask a question, just please write who your question is directed to as well, and then we can help you get the best answer too. Just a note, if your connection is buffering or if you are on mobile data, we hear they are improving coverage to rural New Zealand. It is still an ongoing thing, but you can easily ensure that your quality setting on Vimeo is set to auto, so that if connection drops, the quality will reduce rather than stop cold turkey. So that might help you out a wee bit this evening as well. Right, so let's get started on your first polling question. We will revisit the responses throughout the session, so please get out your phones. You can either scan that QR code that is on your screen now, or go to menti.com, use the code 96607743. And the first question is, what are the legislated 2030 biogenic methane reduction targets? Is it 5%? Is it 10%? Is it 20%, or is it net zero? So what are the legislated 2030 biogenic methane reduction targets? 5%, 10%, 20%, or net zero? And while you're sorting that out, it is my pleasure to introduce Roger Lincoln, Principal Policy Advisor at DairyNZ. So thanks so much for joining us, Roger. Whereabouts are you based this evening?
Yeah, hi, Rowena. Good evening, everybody. Yeah, I'm based in Wellington. And I'd be lying if I said it's still out there. There's a little bit of wind and it's been raining on and off, but rain is good, right? I was up north on holiday, very dry up there. So it's great to be back in Wellington, but a little less sunshine than up north.
Yeah, I bet. So tell us a bit about your background, Roger.
Yeah, sure. So I joined DairyNZ about 18 months ago, and I've come from government, and I've had a variety of roles. I actually started in the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry, so the land sector issues are dear to my heart. So I've worked on domestic legislation, worked to ministers on a variety of things, looked at international sustainable forestry management, done WTO trade access negotiations, and then of late have concentrated on the issue of climate change, so international negotiations and domestic policy. Good to be in DairyNZ, great people, and yeah, it's busy. There's no shortage of issues facing dairy farmers at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's great to have you with us this evening. So we are starting to get some of the polling responses coming through, and it looks as though the majority of people joining us this evening have got it right. The correct answer is in fact B. What are the legislated 2030 biogenic methane reduction targets? 10% is correct, but there is still a range of answers out there. And as we said, there is no right or wrong answer. It is fine if you don't get it correct. It's just to gauge. I mean, clearly there's a right answer in this one, but it is just to gauge a level of understanding. So that was pretty painless. There are more polling questions as the hour continues. But Roger, let's hear from you.
Yeah, sure. So firstly, we're dealing with a smart audience. So 2/3 got that one right. So yes, 10% below 2017 levels by 2030, I think is the legislation. But I wanted to just start by giving you some context. So there's about 5 slides from me about why it is that we're talking about this subject matter at the moment. And of course, there's a lot going on, right? So we're here principally to talk about He Waka Eke Noa, but there's other things happening on climate change across all of the sector bodies. So from positioning the sector and telling our story about our carbon footprint and how greenhouse gas efficient we are, to policy advocacy. So those targets that we mentioned just before, they're up for review in 2024. So we'll need to, as a sector, lobby government and lobby the Climate Change Commission as they review those targets. So we want to incorporate the latest science, and we also want to ensure that that the legislation going forward is right for us and works practically for us. Policy implementation is a big part of what's going on, and He Waka Eke Noa is exhausting a lot of our time right now. Important to get that right, because if we don't, agriculture is into the ETS. And there's also a large body of work in terms of supporting farmers with tools and information, so calculators, workshops, our step change program, but also greenhouse gas research, so looking into ways that farmers can reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So climate change program is big. It's not just He Waka Eke Noa, there's a lot of things going on. In respect of He Waka Eke Noa, so the government in 2019 gave the sector an opportunity or a partnership to work out an alternative to the NZ ETS and pricing greenhouse gas emissions. So what is He Waka Eke Noa? So it's a partnership, and the partnership comprises government, industry and iwi, and they're tasked with addressing agricultural emissions. The partners are there for you to see, and it's fair to say dealing with 13 partners can be difficult at times, right? So there's a lot of compromise, there's a lot of trade-off, but this is a critical piece of work. And the partnership is tasked with creating that alternative framework for agriculture. So looking at how to reduce emissions, how to build resilience for the sector, and then how to price emissions from 2025. Pricing separate from the emissions trading scheme, a separate scheme that farmers can have control and say and voice over. So that's the task of He Waka Eke Noa going forward. How did we get here? Well, this just hasn't happened out of the blue. In fact, pricing agricultural emissions, I think, goes way back to 2003. So various governments have always wanted to price agricultural emissions. In fact, agriculture was going to be brought into the ETS, or was tried to be brought into the ETS in 2008. And then in 2019, following the passing of the Zero Carbon Act, the government actually consulted on pricing agriculture within the New Zealand Emissions Trading Scheme. And primary sector leaders said, sorry, we don't want that. We reckon we can come up with something better. So developing an alternative pricing system to the NZ ETS. And this was formally accepted in late 2019 by the government and is now known as He Waka Eke Noa, or the Primary Sector Climate Action Partnership. this is probably the biggest question that I get from farmers. Why are we doing this? And there's three perspectives. I'll actually give four perspectives, but three on this slide. So one is there's already a legislated backstop. Second reason is there are targets within the Zero Carbon Act for biogenic methane. And thirdly, there's community expectations. So just working through those one at a time. In respect of the legislated backstop, there's already legislation to bring agriculture into the New Zealand emissions trading scheme. So that can be turned on with a switch with an order in council by government. So that exists there. It's a credible threat, we think. And what that means is agriculture would be brought in at the processor level by way of a levy, and sooner than 2025. So here we are in 2022, looking to create an alternative scheme that would come into force from the 1st of January 2025. But if we fail to come together with a credible, viable alternative to the NZ ETS, then that switch gets turned on and agriculture goes into the ETS almost immediately. Second perspective is a Zero Carbon Act target. So these are actually enshrined in legislation. So there's targets, as we've just had from the first question, to 2030 and also to 2050. The 2050 one is a range, 24 to 47% below 2017 levels by 2050. And those targets get reviewed regularly. So the Climate Change Commission was also established through the Zero Carbon Act, and they periodically look at those targets. So important in terms of advocacy and sound evidence that we are looking at that review in 2024. So as a sector, we actually need a mechanism to help us reduce emissions appropriately and sensibly over time. And the third perspective is community expectations. And we're starting to see a real shift, I guess, in community expectations. And you will be sensing this or seeing this yourself, water policy in particular, but also now in respect of greenhouse gas emissions. So zeroing in from community in terms of social license to operate. So really, really important that we manage greenhouse gas emissions. Community expectation is that everyone needs to be playing their part to reduce emissions, and agriculture is no exception. I think doing nothing, the important message I guess I want to get across is doing nothing is not an option, right? We actually need to come up with a credible alternative.
Fabulous. Thank you so. Oh, sorry, Roger.
So I got one more.
One more slide.
So the last perspective is just those customer expectations. So our customers have already made promises to reduce their own emissions. So the likes of Mars and Nestle and McDonald's have targets that exceed our own legislation. So it's not just pressure from the government. There are drivers coming from multiple angles. And just to give you an example, so Nestle has a 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in 2030. So that's their own greenhouse gas target, and then net zero by 2050. So, customers are also sort of demanding that we manage greenhouse gas emissions. Trade agreements also now starting to include a component to do with greenhouse gas emissions. And then I think this is a threat, but it's also an opportunity, right? So it's an opportunity to actually sell our low emissions products. So to summarize for you, Rowena, in terms of context, doing nothing, I don't think is an option. It means that agriculture goes into the ETS sooner than 2025. That we think is a bad thing. And then maintaining a degree of control and voice for farmers is really, really critical at this time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Roger. What a great introduction. And good context as to why Waka Eke Noa was established. I'm going to go back to school and learn how to count to 5 and not stop at 4. You can take a quick break now. We're going to have some questions for you shortly, but now it is time for our second polling question. Just a reminder, you can join the conversation and have your say by connecting to menti.com, either by scanning that QR code on your screen now, or you can head to menti.com, just type it in and enter the code 9660 7743. Now, our second question is nice and simple. It is a yes or no answer. Remember, it is completely anonymous. We are looking to gauge your level of understanding to tailor our answers. So do you know the difference between a short-lived and a long-lived gas? Just yes or no. Do you know the difference between a short-lived and a long-lived gas? Yes or no. Now, while you are having your say, I'd like to welcome Dr. Adrian Macy to the conversation. Adrian, nice to have you here. Now, I understand that, like Roger, you are in Wellington as well. Good evening.
Okay, Norina, yes, I'm in Wellington, a slightly different part of Wellington from Roger, but we have some common ground in that I've also welcomed the rain that we've just had, because those of us with fruit and vegetable gardens have just been, we just have had a sprinkler ban imposed, which is a pain in the neck, but necessary.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, the poor fruit and veggies, they will be needing some rain very shortly. Look, tell us a bit about your background.
Well, I got in, my route into climate change was via the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. My last job there was as our first climate change ambassador. So I did that for a few years. Then I moved on. When I left MFAT, I chaired or vice chaired and chair of the Kyoto Protocol negotiations, so part of the UN climate negotiations for a couple of years. And since then, I've been working through Victoria University with other people, other researchers around the world. I guess the field is where, I describe it as where the science meets the policy or doesn't meet the policy. And we've written quite a bit around methane and measurement and that sort of issue, particularly in relation to the latest UN climate agreement. So that's essentially how I've come into the field.
Oh, well, it is wonderful to have you with us this evening. Thank you so much. Right, let's look at the results of if people know the difference between a short-lived and a long-lived gas. Of course, the answers you could give were yes or no, and it seems a resounding 90% of people do understand the difference between the two. There is a lot of information, though, out there in this sector, so there are still a few who aren't so clear. So remember, if you do have any questions for Roger or Adrian, you can also submit these via Menti as well. So let's hear a bit more about the science relating to methane. Take it away, Adrian.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, I've decided not to complicate this short talk with a lot of scientific diagrams and graphs, which I find are very hard to assimilate in just a few minutes. So I've reduced it to 5 points, but I'm pleased to see that most people understand the difference between a long-lived and a short-lived gas. But let's look briefly at let's remind ourselves what that actually means. And we'll just use methane and CO2. Methane is the short-lived and CO2 the long-lived. What it means that the warming caused by methane depends on the flow of methane. What's the constant flow of methane? The warming produced by CO2 actually depends on the stock of CO2. That means because CO2 accumulates in the atmosphere, basically every ton of CO2 that's been emitted for the last 1,000 years is still up there and still warming. So that's the core difference. We sometimes refer to methane as a flow gas and CO2 as a stock gas. Other consequences of that are, in terms of warming, and I'll be talking a lot about warming in the next few minutes, is that with methane, if you reduce your methane by roughly a very small amount, by about 0.3% per year, you are no longer adding to warming. Whereas for CO2, it's not possible to stop adding to warming just by reducing it. You have to actually get CO2 to zero to stop adding to warming. The other point about methane, you can actually go further by reducing methane below that level where you are no longer adding to warming. You can actually start reversing some of the warming that you've caused by methane. Again, not possible for CO2, fossil fuel emissions. By reducing them, you cannot reduce the warming. And it's been made very clear in various reports, including the special report on how could we get to 1.5 degrees, which is the Paris Agreement target. The conclusion there was CO2 must go to zero. Methane must reduce, but it doesn't have to go to zero. So that's if you like, some of the basic proposition around this. Well, okay, we know all this. The science is rock solid. So what is the problem? Why is it a problem for policy? Well, the problem is that the way we measure the gases at the moment is inaccurate. The measure is called, as most of you probably know, GWP 100. And the problem with that, it's the one that's been adopted by the UN, it's adopted by most countries' climate change policies. It doesn't reflect accurately the different warming characteristics of a short-lived and a long-lived gas. And for methane in particular, it's particularly bad because over the short term, it actually understates methane's warming by about 4 times. You might have heard often this, oh yeah, methane's the most potent greenhouse gas, it's 85%, 85 times more potent than CO2. But long-term warming is what really concerns us. And the GWP 100 measure overstates long-term warming by about the same amount. So that is a problem. And a particular problem if you like in an emissions trading scheme, want to make methane and CO2 fungible and create one currency, you don't have an accurate relative measure of their warming. So what we've got through this, if you like, not necessarily a mistake, but they chose an imperfect measure. What we've got is a disconnect between how we measure emissions and warming. Ideally, you'd measure your emissions and you'd know how much warming they created. But because we use this GWP 100 to measure all our gases, we don't. And we note that the Paris Agreement is a temperature goal, not an emissions goal, it's a temperature goal. We want to get that temperature, keep it to 1.5 2 degrees. Also, I think it leads to a lot of public misunderstanding about the relative importance of the different gases in long-term warming in New Zealand. And if you like, indirectly to the assessment of agriculture's share of the climate guilt, if you like to put it colloquially. However, there's some good news. There is a very much better way and very accurate way of calculating relative warming and methane's warming in particular. And that's an adaptation that I've been involved in with researchers from Oxford and across the world, and also from New Zealand, called DWP star, which you may have heard of. It gives you a very, very accurate picture of relating methane emissions to the actual warming, and it tracks warming pretty accurately. So if we've got this great new measure, how come it just hadn't been adopted by the UN and by New Zealand? It was recognised in the latest round of the IPCC scientific report just out. Makes out the point. It's much more accurate. Well, I think we've got the phenomenon. I tend to call it status quo inertia, and a huge resistance to change. And I'll get onto that point when I get to point 5. Okay, so we've established that the way methane is dealt with under the UN system is very inaccurate. So how do we fix it? We don't actually need to get everybody to say we're going to adopt this new measure GWP star. What we can do is separate out, and very sensibly, we should separate out methane from CO2 for policy purposes. And there'll be actually a very interesting and I think reasonably readable scientific paper coming out. It's a consensus of just about everybody who's written on metrics over the last few years, including people who disagree on a lot of things about ethics and all that. But they're all saying you must separate out those gases, otherwise we've got no idea what the actual effect of your policies, your targets are going to be on actual global warming. So then that also applies globally as nationally. If we don't do any global stock take as how the world is progressing towards the Paris Agreement targets, it doesn't work with GWP 100. So very, very strong case. And of course, New Zealand is already separating out methane. We've made some progress there. The Zero Carbon Act, as was mentioned earlier, it has separate targets for methane and CO2. CO2's got to go to 0 in accordance with the science, and methane to reduce. We've got a 10% target for 2030, yet to be decided targets for up to 2050. So unfortunately, New Zealand hasn't submitted its targets to the UN in that form. It's simply, again, reported using GWP 100. But I mean, what concerns us, I think, in the sector here is domestic policies. The argument that the government has used is sort of, well, it's all been decided by the Paris Agreement. And if we did this, we'd suffer international reputational damage. I don't personally think they're well-founded arguments, but that's where we are. I do think, though, in relation to what Te Waka Eke Noa that Roger was talking about, it's something, it's a gain that you've already achieved, and certainly worth continuing to insist on this. Just also, the third point is really picking up a point that Roger made. There's no case for not reducing methane, despite its different warming characteristics and despite the difference between that and CO2. Why isn't there a case? Well, let's listen to the science first. It's made clear that we cannot meet the special report that they did on the 1.5 degrees target. We cannot meet that if we don't reduce methane, which is nonetheless one of the major contributors to global warming. So let's get that one out of the way. But there's a but here. It's always a good idea to reduce methane, but it is not a good idea to reduce methane instead of reducing CO2. There's a misnomer around that you can gain a whole lot of time for getting out of fossil fuels, to improving our transport performance and industrial heat by getting stuck into methane right now. It's true, you can make an immediate impact on warming, but it's very small. And ultimately, the determinant of final temperature, the global temperature, is the long-term cumulative long-lived gases. So it's not a good solution. I also think that the temptation to use the carbon leakage argument, I think that should be resisted, because it's always that it goes simply, if we reduce our production here, someone else just overseas with much dirtier production, much worse greenhouse gas performance, just steps in and fills the gap. You don't need, to use that argument. There are plenty of other good arguments to use, equity and other things. And the problem with the carbon leakage one, it always comes across as very self-serving. Right, so the fact that we're not accurately representing warming in our current measurements does mean, I think, that if we can get the conversation around to these warming aspects, there are a whole lot of issues here that are worth discussing. I've headed them as effectiveness, equity, burden sharing. I might add efficiency, if you like. We do need a discussion, I think, on how, and whatever panoply of measures and pricing is adopted, there needs to be discussion about, okay, how effective are these measures in limiting warming? At the moment, the policy settings are, well, we know how effective these measures are at limiting emissions, but as I've mentioned before, that doesn't correspond to actual warming. Second cluster of issues around international equity. There's been scant reference to what any other country is doing on biogenic methane, I think so far, and anything coming from the government, but it is surely relevant what other countries are doing, including our trading partners. What are they doing for biogenic methane? The answer actually appears to be not a whole lot. They've got a lot they'd like to do, but they haven't quite got around to it yet. For example, if you look at the recent global methane pledge, and this is a pledge which New Zealand's going to be part of it, reducing methane by 30%. US and EU are key drivers behind that. Now, you might be surprised to know if they were going to hit their farmers with hard targets and pricing of methane. Well, the answer is they're not just yet anyway. They're focusing very much on fossil methane. That's methane, especially from oil and gas exploration, oil and gas industry, and there's lots of technologies they're looking to deploy there to achieve some big gains on methane. On agriculture, it's more, well, we need to work on measurement more, and we need to work with our farmers to find, what are the options that they can use to reduce their methane. I mean, there's some regulatory provisions, of course, that they do have, but no one really, as far as I can see, as yet has gone as far as New Zealand in having a hard target on methane for 2030 and planning hard target for 2050, and B, the amount of we're really world leading in the research that we're doing on mitigation of methane. So that is there's a legitimate point there, discussing what the rest of the world is doing and the rationale for what New Zealand is doing or should be doing. So I think that's one cluster of issues that would be worth looking at. Turning to New Zealand, there are a lot of, I think, the same effectiveness economic issues, but there's also in New Zealand the equity issues too. Equity between the different sectors, the CO2 emitters, the big fossil fuel burners, the electricity industry, what's left that's not renewable, transport, the massive one, industrial heat. What is the equity, between what the pricing that those parts of the economy face and farmers. A legitimate point to make, I think, and that can come back if you centre the discussion around the warming, then you can bring in these aspects of the different treatment required for methane. Also, you can see fairness within the sector, fairness between, say, the beef and lamb sector and the dairy sector. You have different methane profiles. You have the beef and lamb methane dropping, dairy methane rising. When the EU has done work to do burden sharing, one of the factors that they took into account, and this is not methane, but it's just their general ETS policy. Okay, what about, should we give countries credit for early action when we try to decide which country takes on which target under the ETS? So those who've done more to reduce their emissions since 1990 could get some credit for early action. There are issues like that. There are issues like, well, what about the equity between new entrants, say a farmer who's buying a new farm and wants to set up a dairy farm, or existing incumbents? And again, that's an internal equity issue for the sector. Now, I think all those questions I've just outlined, they're highly relevant questions, and they're quite compelling once you take on that warming perspective. But there are no obvious answers to them. I think what they are, though, they're important issues that need full engagement, and that the government should be prepared to discuss and engage with the sector fully. So they're all important, and they're all highly relevant. So finally, to my fifth point, I think there is a role still to be had in challenging what I've called, I might be a little bit harsh on this, but New Zealand official groupthink. There's been huge resistance to any change in the status quo around the treatment of methane for various reasons, which I think are some largely poorly thought out. And this very tight, I don't always call it a tight five in a rugby setting, but it's sort of, you've got the minister, you've got the expert advisors and officials, MFE and MFAT, and the Climate Change Commission, all extremely, I'd say, resistant and sometimes dismissive, and sometimes even hostile to this work that's been done ever since we pointed out this discrepancy between emissions measurement and warming a few years ago. Other parts of the New Zealand system have, I think, taken a slightly less doctrinaire view. The MPI, Treasury, I just listed a few here, MB, Parliamentary Commission for the Environment, the Productivity Commission. They've been prepared to look at these issues more, but I don't think they're currently not having a huge influence on policy. And of course, let's not blind ourselves to the fact that we all know there are domestic political factors involved too. I'm not exactly naive to that. So I think what this resulted in, to my mind, the worst thing that has resulted in for your sector has been a lack of readiness to explore alternative options. Because of this aspect of being resistant and dismissive, it's basically shut off any possible discussion. Instead of saying, okay, well, let's look at what this might mean. What would an alternative set of policies look like if we adopted the warming-centred approach? It's really been battered away. So I think that's, and also I just add a point I made earlier. Some of the argumentation has been, while it would affect our international reputation if we did this, but I sort of say, well, since when has being an innovator, if what you're doing is right, been an obstacle? Then you might have some temporary flack, but if you're right in the long run, surely it's the thing to do. So I do think on an optimistic note, I do think that this ultimately this much more, if you like, coherent and rational approach to the methane will prevail, and I think that the sector is in a very strong position to insist on and to encourage and to achieve engagement with government around that sort of cluster of issues. So that's my 5 points.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Adrian. There's some really interesting points that you've made and also insights in your presentation. Now, there are some questions coming through. It does look as though most of them seem to be for Roger at the moment. Obviously, his presentation was first. So let's move on to those now and welcome back in Roger to the conversation. We're going to start with you. Does DairyNZ support the government's legislated methane targets?
Yeah, I have a short answer and a long answer. The short answer is yes, because we've said publicly previously when the Zero Carbon Act was going through that we supported that target. But I guess I want farmers and I want listeners or viewers to know that that was in the context of a package of things. So the 10% target was also a part of securing a split gas approach. So Adrian talked about that split gas. So recognising that methane is different, it's short-lived. It's not long-lived. So the split gas is in the legislation, and that was part of that sort of, I guess, negotiated package, if you like. But ultimately, the government decides what the government decides. And then secondly, we secured reviewing those targets periodically. So the Commission will do that. And as I said previously, in 2024, that's the next opportunity. So since 2019, there's a whole lot more science around the metrics in particular. So that's good, and we will advocate in terms of making sure that methane is treated with the appropriate metric. And then I guess the other context was, at the time, in terms of reports and the science saying what was possible, 10% looked all right. So that's kind of the history. I think we pivot to the future and we think, what does that trajectory need to look like, out to 2050? So there's plenty of space, I think, in the next wee while to have those discussions about appropriate targets beyond 2030 and out to 2050. What does that trajectory need to look like for methane in particular?
Roger, there's another question that's directed at you that's come through from a farmer just now to say, why do farmers have no control in the NZ ETS?
Yeah, so think of the ETS as just a government-regulated market. And with the passage of the recent ETS legislation and also the Zero Carbon Act, those things are joined. So there is complete alignment between the long-term targets, carbon budgets, and the unit supply settings within the ETS. All of those things talk and speak to each other, and they do so through regulation. So farmers won't have a say in the unit supply settings within the ETS. And of course, we know where the ETS is headed. It has to meet that sort of net zero for the long-lived gases. So free allocation reduces over time. So firms have to pay more and more for their emissions or avoid emissions, and therefore the price goes up. Outside of the ETS, there is a separation, or there is the ability to think about how should methane be priced and what should it be over time. And so maybe the price can moderate depending on whether you're meeting the target, as opposed to destination being net zero. So that's why it's important that farmers maintain voice and control over an alternative to the ETS.
Final question that we've got time for tonight, Roger. This one is directed at you as well. You are earning your keep tonight. Look, New Zealand dairy has the world's lowest carbon footprint. Why do we have to be better if we're already the best? And this is something we hear so often.
Yeah, and it's a fair point. And I guess there's a couple of responses. One would be George Moss, who's a climate change ambassador, always talks about it's a race without end. So it's not good to sit on your laurels and think, hey, we're the best, because there's people right behind us who could pass us. And I won't use an all black analogy there. But we have to keep thinking about new technologies. We have to keep thinking about farm systems. We have to keep getting better to produce nutritious food with less greenhouse gas emissions. As I said previously, the legislation, the law, the expectation of communities and also the customers is that we are doing more to manage those greenhouse gas emissions.
Fantastic. Look, thank you so much, Adrian and Roger. Adrian, there were some questions coming through for you. We are out of time for this segment, though. We will follow up with the other questions after the broadcast, though. Now, just a reminder for you at home, remember to scan the QR code if you have any questions for our next speakers as well. But in the meantime, you can use that same QR code for our third polling question, which is, what is most important to you within an emissions pricing framework? Now, there are 6 statements to choose from here, all down to which one resonates the most with you. Now, that question again, what is most important to you within an emissions pricing framework? Is it that you maintain control of how you run your business? Is it that there are a range of mitigation options available to manage your emissions? Could it be that you're fairly rewarded for the carbon sequestration on your farm? Is it maybe that your levy prices reflect agriculture progress toward methane reduction targets? Is it that methane is recognised as a short-lived gas, or is it that revenue generated by the levy fast tracks emissions reduction technology and research? So you can answer that one on menti.com. While you are having your say, I'm going to bring in our next guest to the conversation to keep things moving. We're now going to hear from Bruce Thorold, Strategy Investment Leader at DairyNZ. Bruce will tell us a bit more about the primary sector climate action partnership, He Waka Eke Noa, the 2 pricing options proposed, and all the things that farmers will need to know to enable well-considered choices. So good evening, Bruce. You travel around New Zealand quite a lot. I catch up with you in lots of different places. You will have had your wings clipped, I imagine, at the moment. So whereabouts are you this evening? Good evening.
Evening, Rowena. Yeah, Air New Zealand has stopped sending me emails, so clearly I'm not helping their business case very much. I'm at home in the Waikato this evening. Be fair to say at the moment we're a little green with envy from the tails of rain down south. Let's talk about milk price, shall we? That's much more encouraging.
Yeah, I think the meteorological term for what you're experiencing at the moment, as I've said this week, is a bit crispy crunchy, but we do have our fingers crossed that you'll get some rain soon. Look, for those unfamiliar with your work, tell us a wee bit about your background.
I'm a career scientist. I started with the Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries, Roger, so that's a previous edition. Before you started, I went through soil science and catchment science and genetics and ended up here at DairyNZ, where these days I look after $20 million of farmers' money, investing it and leveraging the hell out of it to do the research to build a sustainable and profitable future.
Fantastic. I hope you are like Kane Williamson, a safe set of hands there to steady that ship, but yeah, no pressure on that budget though. Hey, look, our question was, what is most important to you within an emissions pricing framework? It's pretty even across the board there, Bruce, but I think the one thing that's coming through, 1/3 of people are saying that I'm fairly rewarded for the carbon sequestration on my farm. Bruce, what do you make of these? And I'll hand it over to you and enjoy your presentation now.
Yeah, thanks. Well, that's certainly been a very clear message we've had from farmers that if they're going to be paying for their emissions, they want to be credited for their actions as well. And we'll get to that later when we talk about farm level options. So, the 6 options there, reflect the complexity of what we've been dealing with in He Waka Eke Noa. As Roger said, it's a partnership of 13 entities, the sector bodies, Maori agribusiness represented through FOMA and government, and there's a wide range of views in there. So to try and help our discussions, we spent time right up front going, what are the criteria for success? How will we know which pricing options are best? And these are the 5 criteria we've been using. The 2 most important and the ones that have drafted out the various options we've had to consider have been effective. Does this scheme credibly reduce emissions to meet the government's 10% target? And we have designed with that target in mind, because our judgment has been that if we don't do that, then the Climate Change Commission and the government, who we report to at the end of April, are likely to draft us off to the ETS. So effective, and the last one on the other end of the scale, equitable. And just to the points that Adrian was raising, we need to design a scheme that works for sheep farmers, it works for dairy farmers and venison farmers. It works for Maori agribusiness with recent treaty settlements, and it works for established farmers. It works for young farmers coming into the system. It works for farmers who have already made a lot of gains in terms of their emissions. So, those have been the 2 most challenging criteria to work on. So tonight I want to talk just briefly about the 3 options that are in play, the ETS and the 2 options that Waka Eke Noa has been working on and wants to discuss with farmers in next month. So the first of those is the ETS, and Rogers actually gave a very good description of how that works. It's a government-controlled market. It's the fossil fuel burners bidding up the rights to carry on burning fossil fuels while they get to net zero. And in our view, that's a place that we don't want agricultural emissions exposed to those, particularly for the reasons that Adrian's talked about methane and its delinkage as a short-lived and recycling, not a fossil fuel-based gas. The impacts and costs of the ETS on farms, we can have a reasonable crack at estimating, and this was based on work that's been done by the Productivity Commission and the Climate Change Commission. And as Roger said, the prices start off low. We expect the price of carbon to ramp up over time, and the Productivity Commission estimates we need to get prices in the $200 to $300 a tonne range before we really start to drive behaviour change in fossil fuel burning simply by price. At the moment, $70 to $80 a tonne is where that's sitting, and free allocation goes down. So if we do the maths, we see that in 2025, our estimate is that a dairy farmer will pay 5 cents a kilo of milk solids for the ETS, and by 2030 that goes up to 16 cents a kilo, and it doesn't stop there. Carbon price keeps on going up, and free allocation goes down. Now, there's an important point of this table about equity, and one of the equity issues that we have addressed is everyone pays the same price for methane. Whether your methane is produced eating pasture or grain or PKE or maize silage, whether it's produced by a sheep, a cow or a deer, you pay the same price for methane. And what this table shows us is that meat producers pay more per kilo of product because it takes more methane to make a kilo of meat than a kilo of milk, and that's simple biological efficiency. So here's an example of a kind of equity issues that we've been dealing with. So this is what we expect the ETS to cost farmers over the next 5 years, or through to 2030. Cost is, of course, was not the only one, and these points have been touched on already by Roger and Adrian. So what are the advantages of going another way, going our own way? Choice and control, bedding in that split gas approach, and being able to price at the price of change, not link that to the price of carbon. Counting additional sequestration outside the ETS and recycling that revenue back into help support change on farm and drive research. Those to us are key benefits of all the options we're proposing in Waka Eke Noa. So let's talk about the two of them. The first is a farm level approach, and the second is what's called the processor hybrid. Here's how the farm level one works. This is all done at an individual farm level, as the name implies. So every farmer has their emissions calculated, and almost all dairy farmers already now have had their emissions numbers from their dairy companies, who've done a fantastic job in rolling this out and really getting some runs on the board for Waka Eke Noa. We talk about credibility. The speed with which the processing companies have rolled this out has been a real plus for us in our work with the government. So farm level emissions get calculated. The price for those is determined. That sets up the charge, and then farmers can get credits around sequestration or management change, or technology use rather. So split gas pricing, A plus B minus C. A is methane, the amount times the price. B is nitrous oxide, again the amount times the price, and C is sequestration. Now, of course, a big part of this is reinvesting and incentivising change and allowing farmers to get their rebate back if they're reducing emissions. So the way this is set up to work in the farm level option is we will be looking to incentivise the use of technology, and that could be inhibitors or genetics or effluent pond management, a new idea you've probably seen from Ravensdown lately, and it will credit sequestration. Now, the important point there is about a multiplier, because what we are doing in Waka Eke Noa is effectively running two prices. What we're doing with the rebates is we are buying change, buying on-farm change, either through management change or sequestration or through technology. So the first price we have to discover is how much money is it going to take to buy change and drive enough methane out of the system to meet those targets. And that's the multiplier. Because the multiplier is a multiplier on the levy price, which is all emissions get paid. So the idea is we charge all emissions at a low level, we pull the money together, and then we use that money to buy the change we need from the farmers who are most able and can achieve it at least cost to drive those emissions down. That's the kind of the two price part of Hei Waka, which is a key part of the design. The processor level hybrid is the second option that we've been testing with farmers. And this is a little bit like the ETS. So unlike the farm level where everybody pays for their calculated on-farm emissions, this takes a two-pronged approach. At the start, the price per, the emissions charges, the levy charges per kilo of product is worked out on national averages. That money is collected at the processor level, just like the ETS would be, and then that money is recycled back through the sector through two things. First, emissions management contracts, where farmers contract to reduce their emissions by a certain amount, what it says on the tin. And the second is sequestration, and the third again is incentivising technology. So the difference between this scheme and the farm level is the ability to be incentivised for management change. And in the dairy sector, this is most likely to look like reduced inputs, reduced feed consumption, and less methane, nitrous oxide produced, all in the absence of new technology. This is stuff we know how to do now. Same deal, A plus B minus C, two components to C. One is lower emissions and the second is sequestration. And again, farmers get a rebate. They get a chance to opt in to an emissions management contract. Nobody has to opt in. Nobody has to reduce their emissions. In fact, all these schemes allow farmers to increase or reduce their emissions as they see fit. So this is really an incentivisation program to get those who want to join in and get going. We believe that's the best way to achieve the relatively small reductions in methane we're after. So as I said before, farmers are incentivised to reduce emissions through management change, are incentivised to use technology and for sequestration. The thing we're not going to incentivise is land use change. There's already plenty of economic incentives to do that, and we're trying to only get at additionality, not at encouraging people to do things they were going to do anyway. What are the impacts and costs of these schemes? First of all, will these schemes be effective? So we've said that we need to achieve the government's 10% methane target. Our view is that probably almost 5% of that target, or half of it, will be achieved through things that are going to happen anyway. And that's particularly through forestry, planting on hill country driven by the ETS. So the second 5% is what we need to achieve. With the modelling we've done with both a farm level and a processor level hybrid, we think that's achievable, with a range of impacts on profitability and production, which we can discuss if people want to. What's that going to cost? So our modelling suggests that the price of change, how much we're going to have to pay to incentivise farmers to make those changes, will mean that farmers pay roughly the same price in their levy, their Hei Waka Eke Noa levies, between now and 2030 as they would with the ETS. So 5 cents and going up to 15 cents for dairy producers. When we look at the initial feedback we've had from farmers before December, and we ran a series of meetings with various groups, the clear messages that have come out of that have been no to the ETS. Farmers, just as we do, see a lot of pain and greater advantages of being outside the ETS. There's a pretty general view that going to farm level is the long-term goal, so that people get recognised and rewarded for or pay for their own emissions, their own efficiencies, not a national average. But in doing this work and consulting with farmers, we have and they have also identified a number of constraints and risks around going straight to 25,000 farmers on a farm level scheme, and so we believe there's a case for transitioning through the process of hybrid farm level to allow more time to develop the technology that we're going to need to break the link between feed eaten and methane production, give more time to develop a really cost-effective admin system so that we don't have to double count and double enter data. We can use the data we're already using. And also more time and more ability to recognise early adopters and management. So just to summarise where this falls for us, doing nothing is not an option. Waka Eke Noa is our chance to control our emissions. These options offer us a split gas approach, they offer us greater sequestration, they offer us reinvestment and control. And the idea we're looking to test with farmers over the next month is the idea that while the farm level is the preferred place to end up, the transition through the process of hybrid may well be the best option. So thanks, Rowena, and happy to get into questions with the audience.
Thank you so much, Bruce. Now, I know this has been your third Waka Eke Noa presentation today, so no doubt you'll be dreaming about options and pricing and split gases, I can't even get the word out, and the like tonight. But look, as always, you break it down into language we can all follow, so thank you so much for that. Look, don't go anywhere. We haven't finished with you yet. We are going to look at our final polling question on Menti, though. It is, which mitigation achieves the greatest emission reduction while maintaining profitability? So scan that QR code on your screen now or head to menti.com and answer which mitigation achieves the greatest emission reduction while maintaining profitability. Is it reducing stock rate? Is it reducing supplementary feed eaten, reducing total dry matter eaten, reducing nitrogen surplus on your farm from fertiliser and or feed? Or is it none of these? Now, while you are busy with that one, I'd like to bring in Waikato dairy farmer Sophia Hunt in. So welcome, Sophia. Good evening. And whereabouts are you farming?
Well, thank you very much for having me on. I'm farming in the sunny Waikato at the moment. It's very dry, and we had some forecasted rainfall next week, Tuesday, but that's gone. So far, hopefully the season continues to maybe be a little bit kinder weather-wise.
Yeah. If it's not the weather, though, at least we've had that great global dairy trade auction last week. We've had the good payout announcement this week. So I guess 2 out of 3 ain't bad. RIP meatloaf on that one, though. Now, we are starting to see some early results coming through to our polling. There was quite a lot in that question, though. Which mitigation achieves the greatest emissions reduction while maintaining profitability? You can see it's still the results coming through and it moving around a wee bit, but a majority of people, nearly 35% I think it is, saying reducing nitrogen surplus on my farm from fertiliser and or feed. Now, I understand, Sophia, you've got some questions for Bruce, which I'm sure other farmers will have as well. So I'll let you guys tell us what you make of that polling result, though, first.
Well, I found it quite interesting. It sort of covers a lot of areas, both feeding and the use of fertiliser, which I saw that there's potentially with the hybrid model an additional 2 to 4 cents per kg of N in the fertiliser. But which emission reduction while maintaining the best profitability, what does DairyNZ see as the most beneficial to farmers, or does it vary for?
Yeah, so Sophia, that's what those answers show is that depending on your farm situation, you're going to come up with a different answer, particularly when you think about, is it cost effective and how does it maintain the productivity of my farm? If you go back to the basic science, in the absence of new technology like inhibitors, if we're trying to drive methane down, we've got to eat less feed. How we do that without dropping productivity, well, that's fewer cows doing more milk solids per cow. We've got to drive efficiency, as Roger said, at the same time as we drive emissions down. And nitrous oxide, absolutely, nitrogen surplus is the key, as farmers indicated. So that's the kind of that's the science, and at the same time, obviously we're driving the technology as hard as we can to break those links between feed eaten and methane production.
Mm. It's going to be interesting just to see it roll through, because for a farm like ours, we do about 200,000 milk solids. So on the lower end, we might be paying $10,000, and on the higher end, it's going to be something like 32,000. So I guess it's every farm will be a lot more different to how they see a way that best fits them. For some, it might be reducing cows and being more efficient on those genetics, and maybe that might benefit from better methane emitting genetics, and maybe it might be growing more feed on farm and increasing the efficiency. So it'll be interesting to see how that dials through. In terms of the legislation and the time frame pricing, what's the time review period? Is it going to be every 2-3 years? I mean, or is it going to be, okay, a farm started out at this point, they've now achieved net zero, do they maybe remove themselves from on the emission trading or the hybrid Waka Eke Noa model?
Some of this still needs more work. I mean, my view would be that, you know, between 2025 and 2030 is not very long. So we're going to have to get cracking with change in technology. The whole thing about discovering the price of change, you know, we need to be working with farmers over the next 2 or 3 years, and having farmers ready to go with either technology or management change. So I suspect we're going to be looking at this every year, because if it's a price discovery process, we're going to need tendering or reverse auctioning or some kind of methodology that adapts pretty quickly to where farming and costs are.
Mm-hmm. Is there any chance of soil carbon being recognised for different farms and different soil types, or the ability to sequester that carbon?
Yeah, good question. In the future, possibly yes, but right now, no. We just don't have the science and the methodologies to be able to accurately determine soil carbon well enough to have money start to change hands on sequestration with carbon. And I think it's worthwhile just putting a cautionary note that, you know, cultivation reduces soil carbon. We know we got carbon loss out of peatlands. You know, we shouldn't be just automatically assuming that as a sector we are accumulating a whole lot of soil carbon now compared to maybe the situation 40 or 50 years ago.
And last question, will the technology be available in 2030 to reduce the emissions? Is there talk or pipeline work in the making to make that happen, or still a work in progress perhaps? Yeah, well, our research teams are in a lot of trouble if they don't. I mean, the good news is we have technologies we can put our hands on right now and make some gains. And I'm particularly talking about, you know, DSM's Bovair product, which is a feed additive that we can feed to cows, and the sheep genetics work done by Beef and Lamb and GRC. So we do have options, and part of the work we're doing now ourselves, I mean, DSM are doing work. Other companies are investing millions of dollars around the world, putting your money through PTGRC in developing a range of inhibitors that will work better than the DSM product, which right now is really only suited to be most effective in barn situations. So we are working hard on how do we make imperfect products like Bovair work well enough in our systems to get useful gains. At the same time, the companies and the scientists are working on developing better products. So I'm pretty confident that by 2030 we'll have technology taking a reasonable bite out of that 5% target. Thank you very much for your answers.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Sophia and Bruce there. So we've come to the end of a very enlightening discussion around agri-emissions, the science relating to methane, the Waka Eke Noa, and what questions farmers have regarding the impacts to their dairy business. There is a lot to look at. There is a lot to consider, especially given that one of the main themes coming through is that doing nothing is not an option. So I'd like to thank all of our experts tonight for their time and their consideration in how to present a really complex conversation in a way that we can understand. It is clear that you have dairy farmers' best interests at heart, and we have interesting times ahead whichever way things go. So if you joined us late or you had to duck away for a while to put the kids to bed, don't worry. A recording of tonight's episode will be available in the next day or two. We'll also answer some of the questions we didn't get to tonight, and you will find further information on the DairyNZ website as well. Just search He Waka Eke Noa from the main page. Now, a series of regional road shows will also commence shortly. Keep an eye out for a session near you. The next Farmers Forum series episode is scheduled for Wednesday, the 9th of March. Now, in that, we're going to discuss the very topical labour supply issue, the implications, and also looking at some solutions as well. So I really look forward to seeing you all again next time. Until then, I'm Rowena Duncan, and Pō Mārie, good evening.